I'm Lynn Toman, and this is Three Takeaways. Today, I'm delighted to be with Alvin Roth. Al received the Nobel Prize. He's a professor at Stanford, and his latest work and new book, Moral Economics, explores some of society's hardest questions. Al, welcome to Three Takeaways.
Thank you.
Close to 1 million Americans and even more around the world suffer from kidney failure. Many are waiting for a kidney transplant, and thousands or tens of thousands die every year. Why aren't there enough kidneys for transplant?
Well, that's a good question. There are 130,000 new cases of kidney failure each year in the United States, but we only do 30,000 transplants. So, as you say, there's a real shortage of transplants. And in the US, that's due to the real shortage of kidneys. And when economists see long lines of people, there's almost 100,000 people on the waiting list to receive a deceased donor kidney. When we see long lines of people waiting for scarce resources, we suspect that prices aren't being used to increase the supply. And indeed, that's the case. It's against the law almost everywhere in the world to pay a kidney donor for a kidney. So there aren't as many as there could be. There's one exception to that ban on paying kidney donors, and that's in the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mhm.
And they actually have an internal market organized by two national charities that allows kidney donors to be paid, living kidney donors.
One thing that strikes me about your work is that you don't try to change people, you change the rules. Is that the real lesson?
Well, rules are important. I'm a market designer. That's the name that's been attached to the kind of economics my colleagues and I do now. But market design grows out of game theory, the mathematics of rules and how they affect behavior and how they determine outcomes in markets, for instance. So rules are very important, and changing people is hard.
Kidney exchange is one example, but you've also helped redesign the way new doctors are matched with hospitals and influence school admissions. Once you learn to look at the world this way, do you start seeing broken systems everywhere?
Well, there are lots of broken systems in the world, lots of markets that don't work as well as we would like. And, in 2015, I wrote a book for a general audience called Who Gets What and Why. And that
Mhm.
was sort of an optimistic book about market design. It said, sometimes markets are broken and we can fix them. But my most recent book, which you mentioned, called Moral Economics, is about what we can learn from controversial markets and morally contested transactions. And it's a less optimistic book about market design because what it says is there are a lot of markets that are broken. They aren't working the way we would like, but they're going to be hard to fix because we can't agree on what we want those markets to do. So I think there are plenty of broken markets, but only a few that lend themselves to uh, overhaul in a way that can gather the necessary consensus to make them work better.
What's really fascinating to me is that many people attribute many of our problems to bad people, but you're essentially arguing they're caused by systems that weren't designed as well as they could be. It's such an empowering idea that sometimes solving a problem doesn't require changing human nature. It just requires changing the system that people operate in. Our instinct is simple. If something is harmful, ban it. You believe that's sometimes exactly the wrong thing to do. Why?
Well, so I think one place where there's lots of agreement is that heroin and heroin addiction are harmful. We would like there to be no heroin. And in much of the world, including the United States, we have very tough laws about drug dealing. But there's a lot of heroin. And it turns out we can't even keep banned drugs out of our prisons, right? So the chance that we can keep them off our streets by purely police and military means seems vanishingly small, especially because there's a lot of evidence that we've tried really hard to do those things and haven't succeeded.
So a ban doesn't necessarily eliminate demand. Often it pushes an activity underground where there's less transparency, fewer protections, and greater opportunities for abuse.
Absolutely. And of course, we have experience of this in the United States with prohibition of alcohol, right? In the 1920s and early 30s, we prohibited the manufacture and sale of most alcoholic beverages. And that didn't work very well. There was still lots of alcohol, but there were also criminal organizations, often violent criminal organizations, uh, that tried to control the market for illegal alcohol. And so in the 1930s, we re-amended the Constitution to put alcohol regulation back to the states. And since then, alcohol has become legally available in most of the United States. There are still a couple of dry counties in a few states. Uh,
Mhm.
and legalizing alcohol has not solved all the problems of alcohol. We still have alcoholism and drunk driving and organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous that try to help people with alcohol addiction. Um, so having the regulated market doesn't make everything work wonderfully with alcohol, which remains a complicated thing to consume. But one thing that has changed since the repeal of prohibition is you can no longer buy moonshine whiskey from gangsters, right? You now have to go to fancy liquor stores and you buy Scotch whiskey that was aged in American oak and is expensive. Uh, so, so we did get rid of the big support of organized crime that was supported by alcohol when it was prohibited. And of course, we're seeing that kind of organized crime associated with heroin and fentanyl and other addictive drugs today at an even bigger international scale.
So the question isn't just, is this right or wrong? It's also what actually happens after we ban it.
Absolutely. I'm perfectly willing to agree that heroin and its sale and use are wrong, but we can't ban it as effectively as we would like. We've tried hard. And so one of the important principles of moral philosophy that I talk about near the end of my book on moral economics is that things that you're morally obligated to do have to be things that you can do. And
Mhm.
so I understand the argument that we're morally obligated to not have any heroin, but it turns out we're not able to not have any heroin. And so we have to think about what should we do given that we can't completely eliminate heroin.
One of the most surprising examples to me comes from Rhode Island, where indoor prostitution was accidentally legal for several years. What happened?
Well, so first, right, that's such an odd phrase. Let me explain it a little bit. How do you accidentally legalize prostitution in a state? And the way they did it was they revised their ban on prostitution. And in the ban, they inadvertently characterized prostitution as street walking, as outside solicitation. And because
Mhm.
that was the problem that was bothering them when they were revising the ban. There were neighborhoods that had, streetwalkers and curb crawling Johns that were bothering the neighbors. So they made clear that they didn't like that. But in doing so, they defined that to be prostitution. So for a while after that, the police kept cracking down on massage parlors that were actually brothels, things like that. But then one of them went to court with a lawyer who said in court, we don't dispute that an undercover policeman was offered sex at the massage parlor that he uh, investigated, but read the law. It's not against the law. It's
Mhm.
indoors. There was no street solicitation. So it took 6 years for Rhode Island to change the law. And so there was a period of time where it was well understood that indoor prostitution was legal in Rhode Island. And two economists, um, Cunningham and Shaw, uh, studied what happened compared to similar neighboring states like Massachusetts. And what they discovered is both sexually transmitted diseases and sexual assaults went down when indoor prostitution was legal in Rhode Island. But not to worry, the Rhode Island legislature uh, filled filled in that loophole, so uh, indoor prostitution is no longer legal in Rhode Island.
But the result was that violence and rape of women went down and sex increased.
Yes, the market for purchasing sex increased. They judge this by looking at the kind of newspapers and websites that support that market. But sexually transmitted diseases and assaults went down. So so you could argue, as many people I think do, that it was a good thing to have legalized prostitution in Rhode Island. But other people, including the legislators in Rhode Island, think that prostitution is morally wrong and ought to be against the law. And it once again is in Rhode Island.
The lesson to me is whether or not someone approves of prostitution, it shows that policies can have consequences very different from what we expect. And essentially, you're not asking people to approve of prostitution. What you're asking them to look at honestly is what different policies actually produce in terms of results.
Right. Now, remember, in fairness to people who think prostitution should be illegal, there are other consequences that we might not have measured, not just sexually transmitted diseases and sexual assaults. I think the conservative view about uh, being more permissive about markets is that we're at a delicate social equilibrium that we don't understand very well. And relaxing some of the guardrails might lead us onto a slippery slope that will cause society to dissolve some of its boundaries and lead us to live in less desirable societies than we would like.
These issues are definitely not as black as and white as most people assume. When people first hear the idea of paying kidney donors or paying for organ donation, their reactions are absolutely not. But this is a market that you know well, you've studied well. How do you think about paying kidney donors?
I think that we have this persistent, vast shortage of kidney transplants. So, as I said, there are 130,000 new cases of kidney failure each year in the US. There are 500,000 people on dialysis in the US, but we only do fewer than 30,000 transplants a year. So,
Mhm.
I'm in favor of experimentation. And one way to experiment is to try with limited legislation, giving some donors more incentive to donate. So there's an act being introduced into Congress this year called, with the sort of grand name of the End Kidney Deaths Act. But it actually has pretty modest uh, aims. What it says is there are presently there are about 500 non-directed donors of kidneys each year in the United States. A non-directed donor is someone who wants to give a kidney to someone and doesn't care to whom it goes. So purely altruistic act, they donate anonymously, and they're very effective in starting long chains of kidney exchange transplants. So they do a lot of good. And what the End Kidney Deaths Act says is, why don't we, as an experiment for a 10-year period, give each non-directed donor a um, an income tax credit over a period, I think, of 5 years, to thank them for and to make it easier for them to do this very good thing. And if the number of non-directed donors went from 500 some odd a year to 700 some odd a year, that would first of all be very good. It would save a lot of lives, and second, it would show that this is a market that we can address the way markets are often addressed, by letting prices work. So I would find that very encouraging if it happened.
So, what we're talking about essentially are what you call repugnant markets, and morality changes over time. Our views on slavery, homosexuality, contraception, and many other things have changed over time. If we were having this conversation 20 years from now, what do you think people would be shocked that we still believed in 2026?
Well, I think there will be greater use of what we today call performance enhancing drugs. So this morning, before talking to you, I had a cup of coffee. And coffee is sort of a performance enhancing drug. On I'm not, for whatever reason, I'm not a solitary drinker. So when my wife is out of town, I often don't have any coffee. And sometimes there comes a point in the day where I feel more tired than I usually do, and I wonder if that's the coffee and whether I'm having mild withdrawal symptoms from it. But But no one thinks I'm doing anything wrong by having a cup of coffee. We think of coffee as food, uh, not as a drug. On the other hand, energy drinks are somewhere in between, right? You can have really high doses of caffeine and sugar in Red Bull or something like that. But the Tour de France is an athletic competition going on right now, and over the years, it's been plagued with rule breaking uh,
Mm.
drug use for performance enhancement. And it makes a lot of sense in sports that sporting organizations are allowed to regulate the rules of the game. I mean, because they want level playing fields. But if someone comes up with a drug that enhances performance, that helps you stay awake and concentrate and work hard for longer, we're not going to turn down a cancer cure that is discovered that way, or a great mathematical theorem, or a peace agreement between warring nations that was only hammered out after 36 hours without sleep. Those will be great things, and we won't mind if people took amphetamines in order to accomplish them. Even though if they do that in sports, we think of them as breaking the rules. So I think there'll be a larger selection of performance enhancing drugs that we think of as safe, and maybe start to think of as food. And maybe our grandchildren will wonder why, when we met people, we sometimes forgot their names. How could you live with that when all you have to do is, eat more and then fill in the blank, and not have that annoying memory lapse. So I'm looking forward, and I pay close attention to the Tour de France, thinking that might be one of the laboratories where we're going to find performance enhancing drugs that don't interfere with people's health.
Al, what are the 3 takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Well, the first is that to work well, markets need social support. The second is that to work well, bans on markets also need social support. And without social support, bans on markets can give rise to active black markets run by criminals. And the third is that lots of discussions that are framed in moral terms are about things that we don't really know how to achieve. And so we actually are compelled to consider the trade-offs among the different ways we might fail to achieve what we would like. And that changes many discussions from moral contests to practical considerations of consequences, for which we need to gather evidence, do experiments, make observations.
Your 3 takeaways are not what I was expecting. What I was expecting, sometimes changing a rule can save more lives than inventing a new technology.
That's a
Second,
good takeaway too.
we should judge policies not only by our intentions, but by their consequences. And third, when good people disagree about difficult moral questions, experiments and evidence is the best place to begin.
So I would say the first 2 of those are so much a part of the way economists think that I don't think of them as novel takeaways. But the third one that you just said, that when people disagree over moral consequences, experiments are important, and evidence. I think that's very much related to my third takeaway, because often people say, I don't need evidence to talk about what's moral and not.
Thank you, Al. This has been wonderful. I really enjoyed your book, Moral Economics.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed writing it. I learned a lot.
Did you? Most people don't enjoy writing books. They
Well,
think
so
it's very solitary and very
yeah,
hard.
saying that I enjoyed it smooths over some of the rough spots. It took me at least a year longer to deliver it than I had initially promised, and it probably was 10 years in the making. I mean,
It was 10 years.
I didn't start by writing a book, but I wrote an article on repugnant transactions in 2007, I think, and been thinking about it since then. I think it's a giant thing in market design. One of the big puzzles for us market designers is why people don't just applaud when we suggest something. What a professor, that's such a good idea. Why didn't we think of that? Often what they say is, professor, that's a terrible idea. That's the kind of bad idea that only bad people have. Goodbye. Uh,
They're just not open-minded enough to think about the consequences.
Well, or they think that I am so open-minded as to lead to the destruction of what makes life worth living and society work well.
There we go.